Okay, folks, I recorded a very long video, and apparently the audio did not take. So I'm going to try and show some of these concepts again real quick and make a quicker video. Just a few things to note here. I'll put in some visual guides. We're going to want to. We're basically going to be using these layers here, and you can turn all these on or off. We're going to be using masks. So just keep in mind a selection can, if you have a selection active and you either make a new layer or go down here and do adjustment layers, then it will automatically turn that selection into a mask. So, let's see, get rid of this layer. So a few of the highlighted concepts from the other video that didn't take were that we can use layers and we can attach them specifically to just the layer below them. So the layer below is the pumpkin here. This little symbol here, which was turned on here in the property of the curves palette, is saying it only applies to this. Now notice, if I were to move this over and turn this off, that this curves layer applies to all the layers below it. But if I turn this on, it only applies to the pumpkin. So without it, you can kind of see that the original pumpkin picture was a lot lighter. When it comes to curves, they're going to show up in the properties window here. So if I select curves, you can switch channels, so you can do RGB, which basically controls lightness and darkness, and all the way from the dark tones or darkest through darker, middle, and up to the highlights over here. So you can grab these points, or you can click where there's not a point to create one and drag it down to darken it or up to lighten it, or you can work on individual channel. So you can see these blue lines here. It's saying in the darker areas, for this one that's darkening the pumpkin, I actually increase the blues in the dark areas, then it kind of goes up to highlights. It's pretty normal in greens, except that we kind of cut the highlights down. The overall highlights, it's normal at dark here, but you can notice from the middle where it usually is, I pulled down the mids quite a bit, and then the highlights are usually up here, so I pulled down the highlights too. You can see what it looks like without that, by turning off the visibility. Keep in mind up here we can change blending modes too, so I did a gradient inside of here where I basically made the shapes, and you can option click on this vector mask to see it. This is only allowing through this layer where I had painted white. So I'll option click this again. And then this is just the glow I made. Notice this has a hard light and 76 opacity. So this entire layer here where I painted some yellow is going to use a hard light modifier to show how it affects the layer below it, and it's only at 76% opacity. Same thing on the lady here. I went through and I did a tattoo here. The key on that is if you right click the layer and you say blending options, it might take a second here. Okay, so blending options, they have these little arrows here showing for the dark areas and the light areas on this layer and on the one below it. Well, what we need to happen with the tattoos is we want any highlights or pores on the skin in the lighter areas to show through, because we can't really see the ink as well there. So what I've done is option clicked on the arrow here for the underlying layer of the lady's face, and that splits the arrow in half. This, instead of giving us a defining threshold, it gives us a range. So you can see that on the underlying layer, I've dragged this so we get a range going from here to here instead of just a solid point. So this is what gives it that realistic tattoo look. And you'll notice if I zoom in on that part of it, you can see how because of that, the highlight's showing through, and this looks more realistic as a tattoo. And of course, we could still change the blending mode, which I have on linear burn, and the opacity. So a few tricks for that. And then we have a curve here to control the skin. A quick note too, you can try and use this to click and set the black point, this to click and set the midpoint. This is an eyedropper you'd use actually out here, and then click on this and use eyedropper to set the high point. But I personally like going through these channels and either moving things, or if you click this hand up here, it allows you to go to the color or lightness you're looking for, and you can click and hold and then drag up or down to change it. See, it locates that spot on the graph for you in terms of lightness to darkness. I'm going to undo that. Also, if you totally mess up, you can hit this to reset it, or you can throw the whole layer away, and you can also turn off the visibility here. So these ones with the clip are only affecting the lower or layer below them. So all three of these only affect the lady. This one only affects the pumpkin. If you don't click this on, it affects all the layers below it. Now I did use some shape tools too to make the face on the pumpkin here. So we'll hit Command 0 to zoom out, so you can kind of see what I did there. And I also just made some simple shapes using the polygonal lasso, and then went up to Edit, Fill, and filled it with the 50% black to kind of give it that 3D look inside where it was cut out. Keep in mind down here we can link layers, we can use layer effects. This button's important because this is the one that takes a selection that you make, however you may make it, and then turns it into one of these black and white masks. Also, this is where you do adjustment layers, so things like the curves we talked about, solid colors, inverting, selective color. And so that makes an adjustment layer. Remember, adjustment layers cannot have their own pixels or photos on them. They exist merely to affect layers below them. And so you can't put a picture or anything on this. You can't draw on it. It's just around to do non-destructive editing or filtering of stuff below it. We can group layers together here. And last but not least, this makes a new full layer. And so this type of layer looks a little different. You'll see it's showing the transparency grid here because nothing's out yet. This type of layer that's not an adjustment, you can actually paint on, draw, and put a picture on. So a very important distinction to make. We can also go ahead and hit the trash here if we need to get rid of a layer. We can click on the name if we need to rename it, and that's helpful. So here, for instance, I could say, I'll double click that and say pumpkin below. As far as any assignments, you always want to name your layers. What you'll be doing in the end is hitting File and make sure that you're saving this as a PDF file. So down here in Save As, we'll want to put a location you can find, and then make sure it's saved as Photoshop. I already saved mine like that, so I'm not going to worry about it. Whenever you see the asterisk, it means it's not saved. So again, the habit of hitting Command S frequently to save it so you don't lose your progress. Alright, so main things to remember, you can go to File, Place Embedded, and that will drop in images. So that's how I got all these images in here. Place linked will give you a dynamic link, but place embedded will actually bring the entire file over here. Now this is important because you would have to send me all these external files if you did place linked. But since we did place embedded, they'll actually be saved in with this file, like the pumpkin graphic, the lady. So that means that you don't have to send me a bunch of extra photos. All that information's in this one. Yes, it increases the file size, but it's worth it in the end. Also remember, whenever you do place, so we'll do place embed here. Yes, place embedded. Place embedded will always make a new layer for the object, and in fact often make a smart object. So if I were to paste in something here, initially I can't do anything with it. These crossbars mean that it needs to be resized first. And so when you're done, you can pull on these handles. I can't resize it and stretch it in one direction because this is on. So if I turn this off, that allows me to stretch it, but you usually don't want that because the image can look bad if you were to stretch it like that. So in this case, I tend to leave that on unless I have a reason not to. And pull from these crossbars. When you're done, you can either reject it if you end up deciding not to place it, or you can either hit enter or hit this check mark. Now in this case, I don't need it, so I'll hit that. Also, keep in mind, you can reorganize layers. So if I wanted to put the haunted house in front of the pumpkin, all I have to do is drag it up there. And see, now it's in front of the pumpkin. The way to think about layers is it's like you're looking down from the top. So whatever's at the top is going to be in front of the stack. And so this lady is in front of all this other stuff here. And then we have the pumpkin up next. Then, of course, the haunted house behind it. Behind that, I actually have the black backgrounds, but it's not needed. If you ever have problems doing something with a layer, make sure to turn off any locks that might be on it. Secondly, a lot of times when I see people have problems with layers, what's happening is they didn't select the actual layer they're working on. So let's say I go up here and I decide that I'm going to do something, and I'll take a selection of this lady. Well, here's the problem. If I try to use the tool to select the lady, it's not actually looking at the lady because that's not the layer I'm on. It's looking at this layer, right? So we'll turn this on. Okay, now if I go through and start painting, I'm not really getting, because it's not following the contour of the lady or anything. It might be confusing to me. But what's actually going on is that the layer I'm on is just this green around the eyes. So I need to make sure I am on the appropriate layer, or I have to hit sample all layers. So sample all layers will take into account things that are on other layers. So here, I can work on the layer with the green eyeshadow, but be using the pixels of the lady. So we'll try that out here real quick. If I start painting, actually, I think I need to change the mode here. Let's try this. Keep in mind the mode up here because I'm in add. Let's try to use the basic mode. I should start kind of taking into account where this lady is, as long as we have sample layers on. Now if it doesn't, we can try a different tool. I'll hit Command D to deselect. Okay. If I'm on this layer here, you'll see it selecting here. All right, a second thing for how to do the digital makeup stuff. One thing I recommend on this is going to the lady and then using her to do a selection for the eyes and eyelashes. Right, so that way you can get a selection because you don't want the eyes to be green or whatever color. Right, so we can go to the lady. I'll hit Command plus a few times here. All right, I'm going to switch tools. And I can use this up here to change the brush size, or I can use the square brackets. Remember, you can alt click or hit the minus up here to take away stuff you don't need. Another way I might be able to do this is to select by color. So remember, select color range can choose things by color too. And you can combine some of these. Remember, if you hold shift, you can add your selection, or you can take away from it while holding the Alt key. So in this case, I'm going to add to it. I'll make sure that's on. Just continue adding and taking away from it as needed. Okay, if I hit Q for quick mask, it's down here, gives me a preview that I can adjust of what my selection looks like. So this is what's currently selected. Everything that's green is not. You can of course double click this if you want to change the color transparency of the mask. So what I think I'll do here is I will actually invert the selection. So it's the opposite. It's everything except the eyes. This allows me to make a new layer above everything else, and I can do stuff like I can take a brush, increase the size here, and I can make sure that the edges of this brush are extremely soft. So I'll go to the brush up here in the hardness. Right? And now because it can't go anywhere in the eye area, but one other thing, it's probably a good idea to turn down its opacity. If you're using a drawing tablet, clicking here will let you actually paint in by pressure how opaque or transparent it is. You can turn this on too if you want to do it by size. But here I'm just using a trackpad on my mouse. So I know it's at about 50% transparency, and I know the edges are faded. So I'm put in the middle of the brush here where I want it to be strongest. And then I know at the edge of the brush where it's fading out, that's where it's going to be the softest. Just kind of painting that in. Now because this is on its own layer, we can change the opacity here, make it more transparent, and we can do the blending modes here, which is also going to control how it looks with the layers below it. Now, if I right click here and I say, actually I need to go over the image itself. If I right click here, I say select pixels, it helps us make a basic selection. Let's see if I can see it. Yeah, so we can kind of see the selection. Now I could turn that into, so I'm hitting Q, once again to check the math. I could actually turn that into a mask first layer too by hitting this. So what that does is it makes sure that I can only paint or create stuff in this kind of soft area we made for this. So basically, that right there, where it's lighter, is the only area that anything can be painted or added to this. So I could try something like going to filter, and I could make something like noise, add noise. Now I'm going to zoom out because I can't see the area. It's going to be right there. So we could try adding some sort of noise to this, increasing the amount. We want to give it sort of a sparkly effect. And that can be combined, of course, with other methods. So just some things to think about. Try and remember to turn these off and on as you need them. As far as selections, basic selections here, circles, squares, etc. Hold shift if you want to keep them exactly square, circular. These have our hand-drawn, our polygonal lasso, which is where you draw it in lines, and then our magnetic lasso, which pulls itself to the corners or edges of shapes. The object selection tool, which uses AI to look for objects. The quick selection, which tries to automatically determine them, and we basically add or subtract to tell it if it's right. Add or subtract stuff from that. Magic wand selects by color. Just remember too that we have these selection options up here. You can select by color range, for instance. Like if you wanted to get all the skin tones, they have an automatic setting, but sample colors tends to work better for me. Now in this case, I should be on a different layer. Let's go to the one with the lady. So I'll click in here. I'll say sample, color range. I'm seeing this white area that kind of shows what is selected, and I can add or subtract. So I notice it's not giving all of the cheek here in the highlights. But I can click in here too if I want. Now we're getting a little too much. I'm going to tell it no, take away from this stuff. You can combine this with other selections too. What I tend to do is get the basics of what I need here without selecting too much of the background. And then I can go in and use other tools to alter that selection once it's out here. So I could say OK to this, but then I could also go through the quick selection tool, or quick mask mode. So I'll click this. Now I can paint with a brush using white to add to the selection. So basically I'm going to say, hey, I know this area is supposed to be part of skin tone. Keep in mind I am at 50% opacity still. I want to be at 100 so it's fully selected or deselected. It's going to basically help along here, knowing what skin. I'm not doing a very precise job right now because I'm in a hurry. But go through and paint in everything in white that you do want. Now I'll just go to a larger black brush. I'll hit X to switch these two colors here, same as clicking this. Now I can just bulk paint out everything I don't want. I do want my edges to be harder here as I come up against the edge of his face so that it doesn't leave like a soft airbrushed edge. If I hit Q again or hit this, I've altered my selection. Remember, you can double click these for foreground, background, gradients like I did on the pumpkin here. Windows has a gradient menu, and you can also go to things like workspace. Will let you work in certain workspaces. I'm an essential, so it's got all these palettes where they are here. This works well for me. If you are missing something like your layers palette, you could go down here and get it. Last but not least, if you move things around, like say you're missing tools, you can't find them, go to workspace, and then you can reset your current workspace. Mine, since I'm an essential, says reset essentials. That will put all of these back where they need to be. Make sure you're saving frequently, and what you'll be turning into me in the end is your full Photoshop file, your PSD file with all your layers and editing intact. Also, if you go to Window History, this is very handy because this shows you everything you've done since you last opened or saved the file. So at any point you can go back in time to anywhere you need or forward in time. So it's sort of like a super undo.